So my name is Kelsey Lee Balaban, and I'm the Community Engagement Specialist with the Yellowhead Institute. I'm Odapaim Suusqueo, Métis, and European from Treaty 6 territory in Amiskwaciwâskahikan, Egwa, Wawasksu, Sakigan, Otsinia. And yeah, now I work for Yellowhead Institute. And this is also our panel of folks who are involved with the Institute. And first I'm going to introduce the context of our panel. So for the past 4 years, during the era of reconciliation, Yellowhead Institute has been preoccupied instead with the concept of restitution. We tried to reframe the reconciliation discussion towards this direction in our red papers, Land Back and Cash Back, the latter of which explored the dispossession of Indigenous communities and how they dismantled Indigenous economies. But this paper was also about how we're challenging the common sense of Canadians and charity and benevolence. So much of the narrative around Indigenous economic development is one of handouts, which is not the reality. So we accepted the invitation to present here with an interest in challenging that narrative and offering Indigenous perspectives on Indigenous economies. So leading this discussion, we have 3 esteemed Indigenous experts in fiscal relations and Indigenous economic futures. So we have Dr. Bin on the end here, Shadi Hafez, and Gali Hwagelun, Tim Thompson. So first, I'm going to introduce our panelists one by one to give presentations, and then we'll have a discussion and open up for a few questions at the end. So we're going to start with Gali Hwagelun, who is a strong proponent of Indigenous language revitalization and is a proud graduate of Onkwawena Kenchokwa Kenyankaha Mohawk Language Immersion Program. Gali Hwagelun has held many roles, including Policy Director of the Ontario Federation of Indian Friendship Centres, Education Director and Director of Languages for the Assembly of First Nations, President and CAO of First Nations Technical Institute. Gali Hwagelun was named one of the 12 defenders of human rights in the Speak to Truth to Power initiative. And I'll pass it on to you.
Sego sewa gwego, wakan horado. Gari wagero ni unjats, waks garewa geni itan, wata ni do ageno. Ne yutununya tikan aiges, ayawans ti sewata garide, danoni, segoskana sewanadunyo. Greetings everybody. My name is Gari Hwagelun. I also go by the name of Tim Thompson, so if you see me walking around, you say, hey Tim, that's okay. Come from Bear Clan family of the Mohawk Nation at Wahta Mohawk Territory. My community is in south central Ontario, Muskoka area. We went over there in 1881 after events in Gunnesadage, not too far from here, next to the town of Oakwa, Quebec. There's a land dispute that's occurred there for going on going a long time. We're getting close to 300 years. But in the 1870s, there was a real effort to force the Mohawk people to leave that area, and some did. Some tried to evade the conflict, tried to find peace by moving to the area where we are. So I'm one of the descendants of those people who moved there. We're a small little community. I'm pleased to be invited here today. I'm glad you're having an exciting conference, talking about really good issues and good ideas. I'm going to take you back in time to an understanding that our people share. Mohawk people, Kanyankahaga people, are part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. So we created a federation alongside the Oneidas, Onondagas, Cayugas, and Senecas, and other nations that joined later, like the Tuscaroras. And our homelands are around the Great Lakes area and farther south into New York State. And we first encountered the Dutch coming up the river system, coming up towards the St. Lawrence. And at the same time, we encountered the French coming down the St. Lawrence. When we encountered the Dutch, we created a trading relationship with them. And we established a treaty with them. Today, it's called the Turo Wampum Treaty, the Degani de Ohade. And in that treaty, there's a long story to it, and we don't have time to get into all of it today, but it talks about a ship and a canoe traveling down the river of life together. And that we coexist, that in the ship it has the European government, the people, their laws, their ways of doing things. In our canoe, we have our governments, our people, our laws, and our ways of doing things. And the way that story gets told, they said, the Dutch person asked us, well, how does this relationship work? Are we going to be as a father to a son? And we said, no, a father can tell a son what to do. We'll be as brothers. And what will connect us is our friendship, our desire for peace, and our desire for justice by one another. In our language, we say, "Ganigoriyo," good minds, to look out for one another, to do well by one another. And they said that they liked that idea, and how long would this last? And so we said, as long as the sun shines, as long as the waters flow downward, and as long as the grass grows green at a certain time of the year. And so a wampum belt was created. We made wampum beads out of shell beads. A belt was created to signify that lasts forever. By the late 1650s, the British moved into that area, and they approached us and they said, "We want the same with you that the Dutch have." And after some discussion, they said, "We would like to tie our ship to your shore." And we said, what if the rope breaks? They said, "Well, we'll use a chain." We said, "Well, what if it rusts?" They said, "We'll use a silver chain and we'll keep it polished regularly." The idea that we would meet regularly to address issues. So that was documented in an agreement in a wampum belt that looks a lot like that. These belts were sometimes repurposed, so they're sometimes called friendship belts. But they signify that three-link chain that links us with the ideas of friendship, peace, and good minds toward one another. In the 1700s, the first imperial superintendent of Indian Affairs, a guy named Sir William Johnson, he was aware of the history of this. He knew that we met every year or two just to polish that chain, to keep it shiny. And so here's a little speech he related in 1748. The speakers at the time were often very humble. They always referred to the past people as being smarter and more knowledgeable, and they would, so they would come across that way, and they were right. But in this case, he says, "Brethren of the Five Nations, I will begin a thing of long standing, our first brothership, our first friendship, commenced at the arrival of the first great canoe or vessel at Albany, at which time you were much surprised that finding what it contained pleased you much, being things for your purpose. You all resolved to take the greatest care of that vessel and that nothing should hurt her. Whereupon it was agreed to tie her fast with a great rope to one of the largest nut trees on the bank of the river. But on further consideration and a fuller meeting, it was thought safest, fearing that the wind would blow down that tree, to make a long rope and tie her fast at Onondaga, the capital town, village of our people, which was accordingly done. And the rope was put under your feet, so that if anything hurt or touched said vessel, by the shaking of the rope, you might know it. After this, You made an offer to the governor to enter into a bond of friendship with him and his people, and he was so pleased that you would find a silver covenant chain that would never break, slip, or rust, to bind you with him in brothership together, and that your people and ours would be as one heart and one blood, and that what would happen to one would happen to the other. After this firm arrangement was made, our forefathers, finding it was good, and foreseeing that many advantages both sides would reap of it, ordered that if that silver chain should ever turn the least rusty, offer to slip or break, then it should immediately be brightened up again, and not let slip or break on any account, for then both you and I were dead. So he had the understanding, too, that that agreement was meant to last forever, last a long time. So what happened? So in time, that agreement gets polished, like I said, every couple of years or so. But by the late 1800s, mid-1800s, circumstances change. There's population imbalances that have now occurred. There's different demands for settlement that have occurred. Colonial laws get put in place that don't respect that kind of agreement. Treaties are made with harsh terms that start to take lands away, even though that's not what was intended on the other side. And indigenous nations start to get put to the margins. Our communities get shoved away into places that are less desirable. When Confederation occurred, an administrative process had already started to administer us as wards of the state. And that consolidated it by giving authority to the federal government to legislate with respect to any matters concerning Indians or lands reserved for the Indians. That same act defined a reserve as federal crown land reserved for Indians. So by virtue of the act, there was no such thing as Indian land anymore. They were trying to take it by negotiated agreements, and if they didn't, they just simply declared that it was theirs. So to this day, I think 89% of the country is still crown land, divided close to evenly between the federal and provincial governments. So it was a great land theft that occurred. Our communities, the reserve communities, plus modern negotiated settlement lands, make up roughly 0.5% of the total landmass of Canada. Again, if reserve lands are regulated under the Indian Act. When you get deeper into the Act, it created a population called Indians. The early acts refer to Indians as males of Indian blood or reputed Indian blood, their wives and their children. Then there was a great effort made to remove women who had married non-Indian men from having legal status as Indians, and we still deal with those impacts today. This administrative system was an experiment, a social experiment. On one hand, treating us as wards that needed to be protected, but on the other hand, trying to assimilate us through this protected status. And so great measures were put into place. So that included having Indian agents to oversee us, imposing what were called band councils, men elected by men to rule us under the authority of the Act. They were given such authorities as the ability to regulate beekeeping and poultry raising, the regulation of noxious weeds, but they could also regulate things like community safety. And those provisions are still found in the Act today. You can look up the Indian Act today and you'll find those are key provisions of the authorities of band councils under the Indian Act. One of the long-lasting effects of that was to undermine our traditional authorities, particularly in matriarchal societies, and to create situations in our community where you have majorities and minorities with no way for the minorities to exercise their voices. So we don't have the Not a lot of our communities have the range of institutions in our communities to be able to have voices heard. And that's one of the lasting impacts of the Act as well. It created dependency. So I know this forum is to talk about ways to get out of dependency, but we do need to deal with the fact that this created dependency. In fact, from time to time, provisions of the Act disallowed us from hiring lawyers to pursue claims. It disallowed us from post-secondary education. If you wanted to get a credential, like to be a lawyer, a doctor, or a priest even, you had to enfranchise. That means you had to give up your legal as an Indian. Those provisions were largely removed in 1951. There were other provisions that allowed the federal government to lease reserve lands without the consent of the community to others. And there were provisions that allowed them to restrict the sale of produce on reserves. There was a great push with the numbered treaties in the late 1800s and early 1900s to force Western nations to move towards agriculture. But when they got good at it, the government wouldn't give them new implements. And sometimes they wouldn't give them new implements under the theory, at least according to one deputy minister at the time, that they should follow the levels of evolution and become peasant farmers first. So all this kind of all these kinds of interventions in our communities and in our lives ultimately led to education systems that tried to really push ahead assimilation and the breaking up of our families and therefore the termination of our lands. So you've heard about residential schools. Hard to miss that. We're finally getting some coverage about them over the last few years. Residential schools took children away from our homes, from our families, 10 members of my family, and they took them far away. Some of them weren't allowed to come home for summer months. So imagine if your kid was taken at age 6. They couldn't come home until they were 16. Could they speak your language? Do they know their roles in your family? Do they even know your family members? We have stories like that in our community from the people who return. Schools on reserve weren't much better. You could at least go home at night. I was sitting with some elders. We had a campfire in 2014. I was sitting with 3 elders. We're in more of a circle than we are here. And they were talking about why they didn't go to residential school. They didn't know why, but they said, one of them just up and says, do you remember the razor whip? Another one goes, well, yeah. So wait, what's the razor whip? They said, well, you know that straight razor and you move it back and forth over the leather to keep it sharp? I said, yeah. I said, what about it? They said, well, if you spoke the language at school, the teacher would give you the choice of the razor whip or the horse whip. And after your whipping, you'd get sent to the corner for further humiliation. So the idea of those schools was ultimately social destruction. It wasn't just eliminating our languages. It wasn't just eliminating cultural thought. It was social destruction. Take us right apart. Make us feel bad about ourselves. I asked them what they learned all day, and they said, well, we'd look at it. They'd give us a Sears Roebuck catalog, and we'd look through, and they told us, pick the things you like out of there. And I said, okay, what would you do the next day? Well, we'd do that the next day. So what would you do the following week? Well, we'd do that the following week. They weren't academic institutions. They were preparing us for a life of servitude. So in the residential schools, the boys learned to clean out the farms and harvest things. And the women were learning the Victorian roles of sewing and cooking. So the goals weren't high with these places. They were meant to destroy us. After all that legacy, we get to the so-called modern day. We face a policy paper in 1969 that says we need to end all the legal entity of Indians and Indian lands. We fought against that. And one of the ways we thought we could beat that was through strengthening community-based schools that would teach our languages, our cultures, teach about our positive relationships to one another and to the land. And that caught fire across the country. About 80% of First Nations in Canada established schools and have them today. The problem is, for many years, decades, they were underfunded. In 2004, I was part of a joint process with the Department of Indian Affairs, and we were asking them, you know, what's the history of the funding mechanism? So they shared a document with us. It was called 1988 Draft Formula Funding. Draft. They said they were asked by central agencies to show a funding formula that they used to fund First Nations schools. And they said, so they made one up. They used the categories from the Ontario Public Funding Formula, like instructional services, administration, teaching assistants, so on. And they just simply applied it to an existing pie, an existing allocation, and then put amounts to the allocation. So the numbers were never based on actual costs or actual need. And those became the historical amounts. Became more complicated so for years we had been underfunded. By 1996, in fighting a federal deficit, the government of the day put a 2% cap on annual expenditure increases on education, on social programs, on housing, on water, on band governance. All of those things were capped, so you couldn't raise them any more than 2% a year, despite the fact we know in education provincial costs were going up by 6% a year at the time, and despite the fact that our population was increasing at a great rate. And that cap stayed in place in education until about 3 years ago, or 4 years ago, I think, when a new funding formula came in, an interim funding formula. It's been much better. It's bought us some time to have further discussions about something more permanent, more long-lasting, something that will support our development in our communities. So I want to leave you with one piece. The Royal Commission report in 1996. A lot of people have forgotten about that, I find, in my discussions out and about. I don't get out much, you can probably tell that. But in 1996, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples tabled a report. And it's really worth reading. It's still highly relevant. Among other things, they said land is key to the relationship. Respecting the treaties is important. They said band governments under the Indian Act do not have independent authority. They derive their powers from the federal government. Moreover, given the limited range of powers delegated to them, there's little opportunity for band governments to access independent sources of revenue. Consequently, the financial arrangements are characterized by dependency, by extensive accountability provisions, which the Auditor General has noted over and over again, by elaborate administrative structures, and by other features that reflect that type of governing relationship. The accountability procedures for Aboriginal nation governments should not be more onerous than those imposed on federal and provincial governments. So they recommended that federal, provincial, and territorial governments, through negotiation, provide Aboriginal nations with lands that are sufficient in size and quality to foster economic self-reliance and cultural and political autonomy. And they said the goal of those negotiations is to ensure that Indigenous nations within our traditional territories have exclusive or preferred access to certain renewable and non-renewable resources, including water, or to a guaranteed share of them, a guaranteed share of the revenues flowing from resource development, and specified potential guarantees or priorities to the economic benefits and opportunities flowing from development projects. So those recommendations are now quite old, but they're still relevant, and I think we need to take a look at them again. So I appreciate your patience. Yawa, toknig.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kali Khakun. That was really informative, especially I really love hearing about the historic relationship and like the covenant chain, polishing the chain, those commitments made, and then all of the legislation that followed that was so out of context of that, those original agreements and commitments. So now Dr. Shailene Jobin is going to present. So Dr. Shailene Jobin is an associate professor in the faculty at the University of Alberta, the Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Governance, and the director of the Indigenous Governance and Partnership Program. She is Cree from her mother, Wetney family, and Métis from her father, Jobin family, and is a member of the Red Pheasant Cree First Nation from Treaty 6. Dr. Jobin brings a focus on the connection between Indigenous culture and economies. Her recently published book, Upholding Indigenous Economic Relationships, Nahiwak Narratives, details the way Indigenous people move with and between economic structures imposed by the settler state, with a particular focus on prairie Indigenous life and philosophy. This attention to the economic realities faced by Indigenous peoples is in tune to the struggles of both land dispossession and the economic empowerment that can be realized from focusing on Indigenous orientations to economic relationships. She has founded and led 2 large Indigenous research and teaching programs and is involved in numerous community-led research projects. I'll pass it off to Shailene.
Thank you. Shailene Jobin Natsigasun, Loretta Watani Nigawi Nehiao, Otsi Red Pheasant, Fred Jobin Pam Notui Apitogasan, Otsi Big Prairie. Hello. In 2015, I tried online dating. This was a new experience for me and a bit traumatic at times. My intellectual reflections on that moment in my life are around the connection to patriarchy, extractive resources, political culture, and Indigenous women's bodies. Also in 2015, I was given this print from Métis artist Erin Consmo. For me, this is a visual representation of this time. I started dating a fellow at this time. Let's call him Al. Al worked in a fly-in camp that was part of the resource extraction industry. He grew up hunting and fishing and continues to do so. His wage job is very well-paying and requires a certain skill set and expertise. He is proud of what he has accomplished. When he is at camp, his life revolves around work and sleep. When he's not at work, he has a few weeks off. One of the interesting reflections from my short time dating Al was that he was expected, and was expected by others, to provide financially for his family and extended family. This was something he felt proud of, but he also sometimes shared that he felt sometimes used. His wage was being redistributed. While dating Al, I suddenly found myself acting as an untrained counselor one day when a woman called me and asked me to leave her boyfriend Al alone. Al had not shared with me that he was in a relationship with another woman. I broke up with Al, but he and his girlfriend hounded me for a while. I made it clear to both of them that I wanted to be left alone. Both of them continued calling me. One evening, Al would not stop calling me and asking to see me. And in a moment of desperation, I told him if he just would leave me alone for 1 month, he could then contact me. This worked, and he stopped calling me or hounding me, or so I thought. What was interesting is what he posted right after our phone call on Facebook. The end of our relationship had nothing to do with his job in the oil field, but for him, it became an easy way to justify his behavior. What became solidified in my mind and body that evening after looking at this meme were the intimate connections among extractive resources, the exploitation of land and bodies, and the political culture that allows these sorts of social media posts to be seen as socially acceptable. The man kicking the woman off the cliff in this image affected me deeply. The political culture in places dominated by resource extraction, where a segment of population believes it is justifiable to have these beliefs, like those implied in the meme, is an aspect of political cultures in certain areas of Canada, like where I live, that we need to discuss more. Colonial domination of Indigenous peoples in settler societies has an insidious impact on the social, political, cultural, legal, and economic lives of Indigenous peoples. Each of these spheres is part of a separate but interrelated system of colonial logics. If we only focus on state domination in settler societies, what I refer to as the first colonial logic, so the Indian Act, the band council system, those sorts of things, we miss an important part of the larger story, namely how attempts to resist state domination may further entrench us in what I call another colonial logic, economic exploitation. One of the concepts examined by critical race scholars is this idea of structural determinism. Cree scholar Verna St. Denis introduced me to this concept in 2017. The general idea is that in Canada, for example, the settler state needed stereotypes of Indigenous peoples. For example, beliefs of Indigenous peoples as savages, less than human, drunks, addicts, sexually promiscuous, to justify discriminatory laws, policies, practices, and processes. Powerful examples of these laws, policies, practices are the Indian Act, or the Indian residential school system that has been discussed. These discriminatory laws, policies led to negative social, cultural, political, and economic outcomes for Indigenous peoples. The resulting statistics, number of incarcerated Indigenous peoples, number of Indigenous children in the child welfare system, etc., served to then normalize settler colonial societies and governments' discriminatory views and discourse, public discussion, debate of Indigenous peoples. This continues as a vicious cycle and one that we're still sometimes stuck in. Indigenous women's bodies are affected by society, including the political and overarching systems and practices. As Zapotec scholar Dr. Altamirano Jimenez says, the body is the first place where women experience exploitation. Now, political culture is a concept that means, as Jackson defines, broad patterns of values and attitudes towards political objects that can, quote, draw individuals together, support judgments and actions, create the character and personality of a community, differentiate one community from another, and encourage its members to seek common objectives. Political culture can be viewed as constitutive. That is, it has the power to create things and bring them into existence. This means that political culture can be linked to behavior. I see certain areas, like the one where I live, and specifically areas where resource extraction is prominent, to have created a political culture around resource extraction. So I wrote this book that came out a few weeks ago called Upholding Indigenous Economic Relationships, and it explores how our relations to the land are constitutive. They create and co-create who we are as individuals and who we are as peoples. This talk is drawn from chapter 6 of that book. And I argue that when we change our relationship to the land, we can also constitute a different way of relating to our other relations, including to women, girls, plus. The plus includes two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, and asexual people. This different constitution in relating to the land can be exploitative, and this can be violent. This is why it is important to explore the history of economic exploitation. Resource extraction is only one factor to examine, and without resource extraction, there would still be violence. However, there is a specificity to the relationships created in resource extraction areas that I think we need to examine further. Political culture can form an environment where both lands and bodies are exploited. Certain practices, like Canada's pass system, that was very common in the area where I live and where my community is, ensured Indigenous peoples, so you needed a pass to leave the reserve. South Africa's apartheid system was based on Canada's pass system. That policies like that ensured that Indigenous peoples became economically dependent on the state. Similar justifications of Indigenous peoples as the other continue to provide justifications for policies and practices that include that exploitation. In an Indigenous worldview, all animate beings have spirit, innate worth, and agency, people, animals, plants. So there is this connection between exploitation of Indigenous lands and the exploitation of bodies of water, women's bodies, trans bodies, etc. It is part of that same logic. In many Indigenous societies, the earth is considered animate. In Elder Elmer Ghostkeeper's book, Spirit Gifting, he explains how adopting technology to engage in resource extraction made it faster and relatively easier to, quote, destroy and rearrange ecosystems during the construction of a natural gas field in his community. This is a process he led. He then explains how during this period, when he engaged in resource extraction labor for his community, he says there is a shift in his worldview. Quote, I did not have time to evaluate my beliefs and practices involving the rape and exploitation of the gifts of Mother Earth, end quote. Ghostkeeper makes this important link. By exploiting the gifts of Mother Earth, there is a shift in worldview that can happen. I see this shift enabling a specificity of violence that occurs on Indigenous women's bodies, where resource extraction creates conditions where this same overall logic plays out. Instead of seeing Indigenous women as beings to be valued in all of our complexities, we're seen as beings to be exploited. Our society's collective behaviors toward land creates and co-creates who we are. Our society's public discourses we engage in create and co-create who we are. Discriminatory views towards Indigenous peoples continue to justify exploitation. The National Inquiry on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls released their final report and calls for justice in 2019. Specifically, on page 584, it states how the inquiry heard testimony and examined, quote, resource extraction projects can drive violence against Indigenous women in several ways, including issues related to transient workers, harassment and assault in the workplace, rotational shift work, substance abuse and addictions, and economic insecurity. They argued that resource extraction projects can lead to increased violence against Indigenous women at the hands of non-Indigenous men, as well as increased violence within Indigenous communities. Connie Greyeyes has talked to women who have experienced violence even the previous night from somebody that they had met that was just in their town working. She says, when you have that dynamic of all that money, of all that pressure working, and then they get to blow off some steam and come into town and party, it is a bad mixture for women and girls of our communities. There is the potential for a positive correlation between self-determination and Indigenous women, girls plus rights, with Indigenous scholars and community activists theorizing and organizing alternatives for Indigenous peoples. Cree scholar Dr. Anjali Aluk explores gendered experiences of work and resource extraction through the lens of Miopamatsuwan, the good life in the Cree language. Aluk links Indigenous peoples' loss of Miopamatsuwan with the severed relationships to the land caused by colonialism. Aluk and her colleagues describe Miopamatsuwan as a good life, a life that balances family, community, and economy. Cree scholar Dr. Priscilla Satay sees social economy models as an alternative to the current economic structure that will lead to reduced poverty and decrease the social exclusion of Indigenous peoples. I use the metaphor of a beaded wildflower that is original to the plains geography to explain Pamatsuwan, a livelihood model. I beaded this flower in 2020 using some of my grandmother's beads from the 70s and home tanned hide we made through a community course I co-taught in partnership with the Sinowitchi-Winnuwak Nation. Although my grandmother, Lillian Wetney, was a beader and I watched her bead growing up, I am only a beginner. The mistakes in the beading I chose to include, one, because that's all I could do, and two, because the work is messy, and yet it is still important. In this model, the center of the flower is the pistil and stamen, which is androgynous in this flower, including both male and female reproductive systems to ensure the continuity of life. I draw from the Cree and Métis concept of wokotuin to acknowledge the important principles that stem from being related to all living beings. The innermost white bead represents spirit beings. The second circle represents all non-human beings, land, water, air beings. The third circle represents a people, for example, the Nehiawak. The fourth circle represents other Indigenous peoples, and the fifth circle represents non-Indigenous peoples. When making economic decisions, a livelihood model reminds us to keep in the forefront all of those different relationships. The petals of the flower represent different aspects of any society, how to uphold Indigenous social, cultural, political, economic, and legal systems. Each bead represents principles and philosophy that uphold relationality within an Indigenous worldview. The leaves around the petals link economic relationships to movements towards Indigenous resurgence and self-determination. Sami scholar, Dr. Rona Kukanen, explains that the most destructive impacts from the decimation of Indigenous economies are social and cultural. When looking at Indigenous economies today, we need to also include how economic relationships might uphold the elements at the heart of Indigenous self-determination. These include the continued assertion and relationship with Indigenous territory and beyond the expanse of reserved territory, reclaiming Indigenous language retention, knowing and transmitting Indigenous living histories, and living out the creativities found in Indigenous ceremonial cycles. I explore how an understanding of a livelihood economic model might enable the social, political, economic, legal, and cultural reproduction of our peoples while upholding the relationships of all living beings. Part of the work of reconciliation, or restitution, is for non-Indigenous societies to deconstruct knowledges that they have of Indigenous peoples, culturally, socially, politically, economically, and legally. It took me a long time to make this slide. I hope you're impressed. And also to then reconstruct those knowledges based on Indigenous peoples themselves sharing of their knowledges. Also, when we think back to the concept of structural determinism, we can think of the power of interrupting that circle of structural determinism. For example, what happens when you insert a resurgent law or policy based on Indigenous knowledges and upholding Indigenous self-determination? Would that lead to positive outcomes, which would normalize a different discourse about Indigenous peoples? When we talk about economic reconciliation or economic restitution, we're often talking about two different things. The first is how Indigenous peoples need to have an equitable share of resources to enable all of us on these shared lands to have miopomatsuan, the good life. This includes revenue sharing, land back, cash back. These are all examples of this. The second aspect is how Indigenous peoples should be able to have livelihoods based on and aligned to our knowledges, our values, our principles, our relationship to land, animals, and each other. So I have the words from Treaty Elders of Saskatchewan recorded by Cree knowledge holder Harold Cardinal and Walter Hildebrandt. They say, when Treaty Elders use the word Pomatsowen, they're describing a holistic concept that includes a spiritual as well as a physical dimension. It is an integral component of traditional First Nations doctrines, laws, principles, values, and teachings regarding the sources of life, the responsibilities associated with them, including those elements seen as necessary for enhancing the spiritual components of life and those associated with making a living. This developing conversations, like the ones that we have here today, are quite dynamic and exciting, and there's a need for additional analysis from diverse perspectives obtained by listening to more voices and Indigenous knowledges connected to place. Further understanding is needed into Indigenous economic relations that are not exploitative in function or design. Knowledge holder Maria Campbell speaks to that concept of wokotuin. She says, there is a word in my language that speaks to these issues, wokotuin. Today, it is translated to mean kinship, relationship, and family, as in human family. But at one time, from our place, it meant the whole of creation, and our teachings taught us that all of creation is related and interconnected to all things within it. Wokotuin means honoring and respecting those relationships. There are stories, our songs, ceremonies, and dances that taught us from birth to death our responsibilities and reciprocal obligations to each other, human to human, human to plants, human to animals, to the water, and especially to the earth. And in turn, all of creation had responsibilities and reciprocal obligations to us. On New Year's Eve, at the end of 2015, I ran into an inebriated Al. It had been a few months since I ended our relationship. He grabbed me and told me that he would often gain entry to my apartment building and stand in front of my door. I was on the 14th floor, trying to decide whether he should bang on the door to gain entry. As he said this to me, it was New Year's Eve. He was holding my arm tightly and would not let me walk away. I felt a mix of emotions, including fear that he had been in my apartment building without me knowing. My friend, Cree scholar Tracy Bear, who was standing by, had had enough and grabbed Al's arm so he would let me go. We left, and I have not seen Al since, although he has tried contacting me. This is just one story from my own experience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shailene. I really appreciate hearing that connection between the violence against women and violence against the land and the disruption of our economic systems all being in one, because when we talk and critique the extractive economies, I think what's missing a lot of the time is that vulnerability created towards women, especially in communities that are near man camps and in these other ways in terms of the entitlement of the ideology that makes it up. And then how you were talking about that's something that our communities have faced throughout history with the Indian Act, the disruption of our governing systems with women being removed from power and being treated this way, and how that actually has this dual effect of reducing our capacity at the same time. So thank you for bringing that to attention. We have our last panelist now, and this is Shadi Hafez. So Shadi is Algonquin, Anishinaabe, and Syrian, and is a member of Kitigan Zibi Anishinaabeg. Shadi is currently a PhD student in sociology at the University of Toronto, a Yellowhead Institute Research Fellow, and is also the programs manager to the National Association of Friendship Centers. With over 15 years' experience working directly with and for Indigenous communities, Shadi has supported communities in the development of programs and services related to health and social well-being, as well as political and economic autonomy. Most recently, Shadi has overseen the delivery of the Investment Readiness Program for the NAFC, which has provided urban Indigenous organizations with over $4.5 million in capital to pursue the development of Indigenous-owned social enterprises. Shadi is committed to the resurgence and political independence of Indigenous peoples and communities and strives to support his communities wherever and however he can. Pass it off to Shadi.
Miigwech for the introduction. Kwekakina, Shadi Hafez, Nijnikaz, Kitigan Zibin Donjaba, Mikanak Dodem. Just my name is Shadi Hafez. As mentioned, I'm Algonquin Anishinaabe and Syrian. I'm a member of Kitigan Zibi Anishinaabeg, which you're actually on our territory right now, so welcome to our territory if you're not from here. My community is an hour and a half north of here, just up the Gatineau River. I've resided between here and my community throughout my life. Miigwech to fellow panelists, those presentations were set a really high bar, so I will do my best. But I think it actually fits really well because Tim provided us with some really great historical context, I think, to the relationship, and Shailene provided us with an understanding of how that kind of trickles down into today, and that understanding of how these economic structures impact our communities. And I'm going to be talking a little bit today about some of the work that we've done as an organization. I work for the National Association of Friendship Centers with the Investment Readiness Program, but also some of my personal work in the economic development, and business development, and community, and issues around the current economic models, financial institutions, and issues around capital and investment in our communities. I'll give a little bit of context. So I've been working as an independent business development consultant for my community now for, I don't know, for quite a long time. And what that's looked like is basically I've been writing business plans for local entrepreneurs in the community. But aside from that, I'm also a researcher for our specific claims team in our community. And specific claims, for those who don't know, are a government-created mechanism by which our communities can address past wrongs related to specific aspects of land, mismanagement of monies historically. They're different from comprehensive claims that deal with larger territorial issues. Most notably, our community settled a specific claim a few years back for roughly $116 million that we received as compensation for the way that the government essentially chiseled away at our reserve lands and reduced the size of our lands. An interesting aspect of that I think I will be touching on is that, part of that is that 40% of that 116 million was actually distributed to band members as a per capita settlement payment. So every band member received roughly $13,000 as a one-time payment for those lands. And I'm going to talk about some of the issues around that after, but just to touch on some of the historical issues related to these specific claims I've worked on and that I've seen in my own work, and to build on what Tim had mentioned regarding the Indian Act and Indian agents, we see that there was not only just a reduction of a land base and a theft of land that took place that reduced our abilities to participate in the economy, but there was a wholesale theft of money from our band accounts. These Indian agents, and in the case of my community that we're exploring right now through our own research process, we're siphoning money out of our band accounts to pay for infrastructure in our neighboring towns, to pay for the roads in the neighboring towns, to pay for the plumbing in the neighboring towns, to pay for their friends to borrow money from our reserve bank accounts to purchase their homes and their cars. And those monies were never repaid back to our communities. And so you can see when somebody else, especially a colonial administrator, was placed in a position of authority over our bank accounts and over our funds, the limitations, obviously, that created for our participation in the economy when we have wholesale theft of land and of any monies that we might have within our accounts at the time. And so that's kind of something that has emerged as something I'm noticing in my own research process with our specific claims team. On another note of that, is the ways that our internal economies have developed in relationship to the economies that have surrounded us. And so going back to this huge influx of capital into our community, $116 million given to our community in compensation for a very small town. I don't know if anyone's ever been to Maniwaki, Quebec, but yeah, it's not a big town. That's $116 million for that. When we compare that to the rest of our territory that has been taken and stolen from us, I mean, we're talking a value of billions that has been our community, not just our nation, our community, that we've no longer had access to develop, to do whatever we want within our territory. And then that 40% was distributed to our community as compensation for those lands and as a settlement. But unfortunately, within our community, we don't really have much economic development. If you work for the band, administration or the health center, that's basically the working class community within our community. There's one or two business owners who I would say, have a monopoly over gas and other kind of staple economies within the community, but there isn't much else. And so that $13,000 that was given to each band member, say, immediately left our community. It was gone. So the second people got that money, it was paying off debts, credit card debts, Visa debts, loans. It was purchasing things from the town and neighboring town, four-wheelers, boats, trailers, trucks, whatever that might look like. And so we saw instantly 40% of $116 million essentially evaporate from our community very quickly. And so that lack of having a really internal economy structured within our own community, I'm speaking from my specific context, is reflective of this larger issue, is that there are times where there's influxes of capital within our community, or introduction of capital, and it's been leaving our community quite quickly. And just to touch on this note about land and specific claims, again, I'm going to be kind of going all over the map here, so please bear with me. But just to contextualize things even more for folks when it comes to kind of this access to land theft, access to capital, we're in a hotel right now in Ottawa. We're at we're at the Delta. The Delta is built on top of a piece of land that somebody paid for from somebody else. that that person paid for from somebody else, but at one point in time, somebody was just given this land or took it. They did not pay for it on some level. And they inherited that wealth that they made from selling that land the first time to somebody else. I'm sure there's still a family somewhere benefiting from that inherited wealth on some level to some extent. And then when we consider every plot of land within this city, and we consider that somebody somewhere didn't pay for it originally from the very start of that. And when we really think about that and contextualize it, then we kind of begin to see the level of theft and the level of that kind of destructive relationship that has taken place with our communities. And the head start that most Canadians, that can trace their roots to the early settler colonies here, the head start that they received and the handout, I'm going to use the word handout because that's often utilized in relation to our community, but the handout that early Canadians received to start and build this country, and the handouts that they're still receiving to build this country. And we can talk about bailouts of certain businesses and certain financial institutions, that there's always been a handout aspect in this country. Now I'm going to bring this back to some of the local work I do around business development within our communities. So I've been working with local entrepreneurs and community for quite a long time to help them develop their business ideas and essentially access capital, to whether that's startup loans, from $10,000 for a small business up to $500,000 for whatever businesses. There's some pretty significant issues, and I'm going to speak to the on-reserve reality first and then speak to the urban reality with our investment readiness program that I run. When an individual business owner in a community is kind of seeking, as I mentioned, there isn't somewhat of an internal economy within the reserve system where there's a professional working class in a way, I guess I could call them that, people who work for the band or the local administration. Aside from that, there's not much stable employment within my community outside of seasonal extractive industries like forestry or mining, say. But so if somebody wants to start their own business, they can't access a loan through a traditional financial institution. And if they could access a loan through a financial institution, the relationship that exists between the local financial institutions and our communities, unfortunately, is still, there's still an element and an aspect of racism, an element or an understanding that those spaces are not for Indigenous people, especially visible Indigenous people, going into a bank to access loans, to sit down with somebody and to have that conversation about accessing capital to start a business. In addition, for a lot of loans, you need capital. Sorry, not capital. I'm having a brain fog here. You need collateral, sorry. You need collateral to access the loans. And unfortunately, the way our land regimes are set up in community, I won't say unfortunately, actually, because I think it protects our communities in a lot of ways. But the individual entrepreneur just can't access that through those financial institutions. And so we have, these alternative mechanisms now that are created for entrepreneurs in local communities, but the hurdles they have to jump through to access loans or grants through those systems are pretty significant. And there isn't much being invested in actually, one, making those pools of capital known to entrepreneurs and to business owners, but two, kind of supporting those business owners in accessing those funds. And so, and there's an additional element or aspect to that, which is something I've always pushed, is that our business owners are now being asked to borrow money to start up new endeavors within our community, where all the businesses around us, outside of our community, didn't have to go through those same barriers. A lot of those businesses are inherited over generations around our community. Some of those businesses were built off of our lands, built right on top of our stolen lands, through our stolen monies. And so I do advocate that on some level, there needs to be an injection of non-repayable capital, not loans, but funds to our communities to help business owners through grants to build and develop their businesses. And these need to be accessible outside of traditional financial institutions, outside of institutions that want to make money off of our communities. There's still a very a system created, I think, where people are still capitalizing and making money off of our own development. And so our development is not just seen as an opportunity to build and grow our nations, but by external investors it's being seen as an opportunity to continue to enrich themselves and to grow their pockets off of our developments. And sometimes, the investments aren't really supporting what's needed on the ground. And the last thing I'll talk about, just with regards to this community internal economic development, I talked about the 40% that was distributed to our community members. 60% stayed with our band, and that was put into a trust. Now, a lot of our communities are in court, are receiving settlements, and those funds are going into band trust accounts or different banking or financial institutions. And now communities are faced with the question that we're no longer just receivers of funds, but we're now in a position to invest. And we're in positions to invest in economies, in the economy, the Canadian economy, or in our own local economies. And questions are now emerging: what do we invest in? What do we utilize our money for? What do we want to build? And how do we invest? What's going to guide our investments? I won't talk about what our community is invested in, but there was some issues around how our money was being used and what types of industries they were supporting, and community members were not happy about certain things. And so these questions are now emerging, I think, in ways that really didn't exist historically. When you have communities that have 100, 200, 300, 400 million trust accounts, and they're trying to figure out what to do with that money and how to keep it sustainable in the long term for community. And so these are questions that I think we're engaging with, but I think Dr. Shailene's example, of thinking about how we can structure things with our own values and our own ethical approaches in mind is important. This is a good opportunity now, I think, just to segue into some of the work we were doing as the National Association of Friendship Centers. So we're part of a program called the Investment Readiness Program. We're a funding partner in this program. We're going into our 4th year of the program, and to date, we're going on distributing almost $7 million to friendship centers and other urban Indigenous social purpose organizations to develop their own social enterprises. And we've developed a model that I think is reflective of an alternative kind of economic reality or relationship, or alternative way of thinking about economies, about business, and about development within our community. So friendship centers and a lot of other urban Indigenous organizations, or just Indigenous organizations in general, are still sitting at really high thresholds when it comes to our revenue streams. And so we're looking at some places like up to 98% is still just specifically related to federal funding payments. And so as we've seen in the past, policy changes, government changes, sometimes result in those organizations losing all funds, losing access to all funding. And we saw that with when the Conservative government was in place, and the defunding of NAHO and the overnight disappearance of a national health organization. And so, we're kind of trying to think about how we can stay sustainable in those situations where governments change, policies change, directives change, and one of those, we don't want to let government off the hook. We're not saying government needs to stop funding us and we'll fund ourselves through business and economic development, but one aspect of responding to that is by developing our own social enterprises. And so we've developed this model where we provide non-repayable capital, which is important, non-repayable capital, to our organizations to develop businesses that they propose to us. Now, these businesses, we only fund them if they kind of adhere to these 3 types of principles that we've developed, which are, 1, the business has to address a social need. So we don't actually really want to advocate or believe in just doing business for business sake, making money just to make money. But rather, we want to see these social enterprises developed to address a specific need within the community, and I'll talk a little bit about what those look like. The second aspect is that the enterprise itself must have a positive impact in the community. So we don't want to get into businesses that have a negative social impact in the community. We don't want to get into businesses that are controversial or not in line with Indigenous values and ethics. And the last aspect of it is that these businesses have to contribute to the generation of collective wealth within the urban Indigenous community. And so that can look like the redistribution of capital back into the community. That can look like employment employment programs offered through the business itself, or that can look like those funds returning back to the organization to deliver programs and services to the community, host events for the community. But we want to see that the revenues essentially are not just being kind of held, but they're being redistributed back or sustaining the organization itself. So today, we're going on funding almost 100 different social enterprises across the country, and I'll give a brief example of some of these projects that we funded and what they're doing and what the impact of those projects are. There's a number of friendship centers that have now developed their own hotels. They own their own hotels within communities and within community spaces. These hotels aren't just like it's not the Marriott, it's not the Hilton, obviously, but these are spaces where people wanting to come into town to go to the hospital, to seek certain social services, etc., they can stay for a short term while they're there. Now, historically, what took place is, I'll use examples of my community, more northern remote communities, when they would send people from their communities to Ottawa to, let's say, go to the hospital, get surgery, seek different services. Those folks would often be hosted at privately owned hotels or motels, sometimes in pretty rundown parts of the city, not safe spaces for communities, not safe spaces for vulnerable people. And the band would be paying those hotels essentially to host them. And so some of our centers now have said, you know what, we'll take over that. We'll build our own hotels in safer parts of the city. Where the people staying there will have access to social services, will have access to culturally relevant services. And for the communities that are paying, instead of spending that money outside of the Indigenous community, pay us, we'll host the people, and that money is going to get reinvested back into the community through that business model. And so we have a number of communities now that have actually developed that business model. They have agreements with local First Nations, and they're building, an internal economy, I would say, where the money from our communities is not leaving our community, but it's staying within our community. And I think we need to be quite unapologetic about that, because sometimes promoting this idea of exclusion or internal economies is like, well, you don't want to participate with the rest of Canada. And as Indigenous communities, I think we should be able to say, no, we don't want to participate with the rest of Canada. We're good. We're going to stay and build our own internal economies. Some other aspects as well, in the Northwest Territories, we have some of our friendship centers who are, obviously, I think we all know with the disappearance of Greyhound and some of these busing services, transportation to more rural and remote places has been a challenge. And so we have some of our friendship centers now that are trying to jump in to address this and say, we'll use our centers as transportation hubs for people within the urban Indigenous community. And so if you need to travel from place to place to place, they're trying to set up transportation services at a very low cost. Mostly the cost is just to sustain the service itself. So I mean, these are just some examples of the businesses that are being developed. Another great one, we funded a project in Courtenay, BC. Is my time up? Okay. That was a screen printing studio, and basically we funded them to open up this pretty industrial screen printing studio out of the Friendship Center. They utilized the studio to help local Coast Salish artists produce their art at a lower cost than they would pay other companies. They also produce, for people in the town, T-shirts, like funding drives, any types of advertising things. But the space is also utilized as a place to train local youth in how to use screen printing supplies, how to do industrial screen printing. So they do training programs, but also art programs out of that space. And so we kind of see a dual purpose coming out of there. And the business itself generates pretty healthy revenues that go back into the Friendship Center that are unrestricted funds. So the Friendship Center can use that money any way they want to use that money, and they don't have to report to anybody on how that money is being used, aside from their own members, right? That's my talk. And thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. That was a really good overview of the systemic barriers that are still in place and all of the ways that we're trying to combat them. And I'm going to jump into questions. We We have about 15 minutes left, just so you know. So, Galihua Gelun, and anyone else who wants to answer. Since 2015, Liberal governments have been exceptionally busy on Indigenous policy and law, and Yellowhead Institute found that it's actually been the most busy since Confederation. But despite that, there has not been an economic development strategy developed in this time. So what's the holdup? Why has there been so little focus on this?
It's a good question. There is a lot of activity. Over the last number of years, there's a lot of agencies that have been created. One that deals with land management in a reserve setting. There's another agency that, set of agencies that deal with issues like accessing large-scale loans for large-scale developments and property taxation. You can talk about the relevance of those. They're relevant to those communities who have engaged in those kinds of practices. But dealing with the more difficult items, such as treaty relationship and lands, are a struggle for governments, and they're a struggle for governments of all stripes that we've encountered, at least the ones that we continually have to deal with. I read to you a couple of recommendations from a commission that's almost a report that's almost 30 years old. We haven't made movement on that, or enough movement. We've seen examples, but those real issues of access to land and how to deal with, our appropriate or our visions of appropriate development have not been successfully dealt with in that time, generally.
Yeah, and that's so foundational to everything too, so it's so important. Okay, Shadi, for you, a lot of the discussion around Indigenous economies has been focused on reserve, which you got to talking about a little bit today. But we know that over 50% of Indigenous people live off reserve. So what are the key distinctions here when thinking about urban Indigenous economies?
Yeah, I think the experiences and realities can be quite different, especially given the context of where people are living or what cities they're living in. But I think not just the urban Indigenous economy per se, but urban Indigenous experiences with economic systems and with financial institutions. The experiences can be quite problematic and I guess troubling. Like, we had the example in Vancouver, where the gentleman and his granddaughter were at the bank and essentially had the police called on them for using their status cards as identification. And that's just reflective of a larger picture that there is these institutions, along with a lot of different institutions, and whether that's grocery stores, whether that's malls, whether that's any space where Indigenous people walk into and are followed around by security guards and they're made to feel like their business is, one, not welcome there, that these spaces are not for them, that banks are not places for them, that they're not welcome in those financial institutions. And so I think, and this affects both the urban and the rural context, respectively. But those are some of the experiences. And so these institutions, are not places that we feel like are developed for us to help us or to assist us. Now, the other aspect of that too, in relation to urban Indigenous economic development, the barriers that exist to access to capital on reserve are very similar barriers that exist for Indigenous people accessing capital in the city. And again, that's the relationship of collateral, of ownership of land, of having wealth to build wealth. I wouldn't want to do a show of hands, but I mean, there's a specific segment in this population that inherits wealth, and there's a specific segment in this population that does not inherit wealth. And I'll say, for Indigenous people and newcomer communities, those are specific communities that do not inherit wealth. When my parents pass on, I will probably be getting diddly squat from them because there isn't anything there to hand off. In terms of, I shouldn't say that because I'm sure I'll get something, but I mean, something beneficial to me that, but in terms of an asset that I can utilize to build some kind of wealth within the current structure that we live in, very little. And I think a lot of our community members deal with that. And so those systems then that have been created to address some of those gaps, specifically on reserve and funding agencies and bodies that are trying to address those gaps, there's been and I won't get into a huge critique of a distinctions-based approach, but urban Indigenous peoples have been left out of some of the mechanisms that have been created to respond to some of these issues on reserve. And so urban Indigenous access to pools of funds that, might be specifically reserved for, on-reserve business entrepreneurs or on-reserve business development, we don't necessarily have access to within the cities. And so that kind of limits our ability to participate. And then the competition level in the cities is just really different. And so for Indigenous businesses and entrepreneurs, you not only have to deal, if you're starting a business that has some kind of Indigenous focus or spin to it, you also have to deal with the reality that there is still ongoing racism and prejudice towards Indigenous peoples. And so how successful will those businesses be within a climate that is not receptive to Indigenous people generally? And so those are some things to think about. That being said, there are really successful examples within cities of urban Indigenous economic development. You're in Ottawa, I encourage you to go to the Byward Market. There is a social enterprise there that is owned by the Assembly of Seven Generations. There's Indigenous Experiences that has a Matawaki farm on the outskirts of the city where they do all types of cultural tourism, business, and so there's also Bean Again Cafe at Lansdowne, which is an Indigenous-owned cafe. I encourage you all to check out as well. So there are examples of business development and growth in the city as well. Yeah.
Thanks, Shadi. For Shailene, your book is so large in scope and it's covering both traditional Nehiyaw economies and the distortions of colonial dispossession to get to a point of economic resurgence. So I'm wondering you talked about it a little bit, but what you believe principles of authentic or traditional economic relationships are today. And then I'm also wondering about if you think those are possible to live alongside the current economic system, or if they're incompatible, and who does that benefit? Who do Indigenous economies benefit? Just Indigenous people or everyone?
Thank you. My watch, it's on airplane mode, but it keeps telling me to breathe and stuff. I'm like, what's going on? Thank you so much. Two things come to mind with that. One of the things I thought through is this idea of colonial dissonance. And who here's heard of cognitive dissonance? Yeah, okay, so we can think of cognitive dissonance, but I think sometimes for Indigenous peoples, we have this colonial dissonance. So we can think of cognition, that dissonance, but we can also think of emotional dissonance, spiritual dissonance, physical dissonance. And so sometimes the complexity is we have these values and principles, and I interviewed different knowledge holders and elders and in my area, and one of the things Sonny talked about is he's like, I hold a sweat lodge, and I have people coming in that are in the resource extraction industry, and they say, I have these teachings that I believe, and then I'm doing this work, and it creates this dissonance in me. And so I think that's one of the complexities that we can talk about. But I also think that in that dissonance, we can see the complexity of it, but it's also a site of creativity and resurgence, that in that uncomfortable space, we can think of really creative ways to do things differently. And I think at that principle base of in each society, thinking of those principles, those can be applied today in a lot of the ways Shadi talked about. And also that there are also other practices that can be really helpful, whether you're living in a more rural area or in a more urban environment. And so talking about on-the-land practices, talking about language camps, talking about getting into those spaces of redistribution of, for example, in my area, we have a mataito, which is a certain type of giveaway that happens when there's snow on the ground, and it reestablishes those relationships between all those different beings. And so those different practices that we can still do, we're still living in a neoliberal kind of hyper-capitalist, late capitalism realm, but they're like salves to that dissonance, and then that can kind of help us think through that ways and have that creativity to also imagine a different future where some of the really negative aspects of capitalism and colonialism can be maybe overturned.
Thank you, that was amazing, an amazing answer. So I have a question that's kind of on the same topic as that for everyone to answer. So how do we retain our values as Indigenous people in the midst of a resource rush from mining to housing developments that we're expected to participate in? There are many advocating for economic reconciliation, but what does that mean in our own communities, according to you? So we can start with you, if you'd like. Or whoever wants to speak first, actually.
Okay. Those are challenges faced by each community and nation, right? Ultimately, the community has to be empowered to be able to address that at some level. So that's a first step. So the question we ask ourselves is, what is the relationship between our identity and any kind of change that might occur to our community? And if it's specifically a large-scale economic enterprise, what does that do to us mentally, spiritually, physically, emotionally? And to ask ourselves that question. We have in one of the Mohawk communities, we have a framework that was developed that helps us think about that, around what's the impact of our actions on the people around us, our family structures, our community structures, Mother Earth, the waters, everything that moves and grows, and we name them. So what's the impact on each of those beings from our actions, not only now, but for the next 7 generations going forward? And so if we ask ourselves that and we engage in that deliberation, then we start to assess what the impact will be on us.
I think for me, it's having mechanisms for community accountability to hold whatever process or business activity or economic development activity you're participating in, to have something embedded within your governance structure that one can guide that, and two can hold you accountable when you step out of line. A lot of our traditional governance structures had those embedded within them, and I think some of our organizations now and nations are trying to figure out ways to reconstitute that. As an example, our organization at the national level, we have a Senate that is composed of the elders within our Friendship Center movement, some of the early founders of our centers that hold the movement accountable to the values and principles of the movement, to what it was established and what it was meant to do. We also have a youth council as well that holds us accountable to help us think about how our actions and our work is going to impact generations to follow, and to ensure that we have that inclusion and that voice within there as well, along with our regular, in addition to our regular governance structure. I also think outlining outlining the values and ethics of the community itself as derived from those governance structures and accountability mechanisms is really important to clearly indicate what you will and won't engage with as a community or as an organization, and to make those principles and those statements really clear and to not be vague about them. If you're not going to engage with extractive industries, say we're not going to engage with extractive industries, and that's something we just don't want to make money off of. If you don't want to engage in this, that, or the, you know what I mean? It's just, it's very easy to lose focus and thinking towards community and why you're actually doing this work in the end. So.
Yeah, and drawing on what the other two panelists said, I think there's some really interesting models being developed by Indigenous communities and nations and Indigenous organizations that push the boundaries of what wealth means and kind of provide more holistic frameworks for thinking about how we think through community development. And yeah, and so we could think of even those conversations about GDP and are those the appropriate measures? Or there's a book about wellness and thinking about what wellness means instead of these different indicators, and thinking about, I'm thinking about other models that talk explicitly about those different values to the environment, those different values of the self, and explore that at an individual, at a family, at a community, and at a nation level. And when they're doing that long-term planning, thinking through what are those different implications when we are doing different economic development, or when we're doing different types of community building, how will those be implicated? And then it's also a measurement tool to see, okay, we did this 5 years ago, how are we on all these different 16 different indicators, and what are those areas that are out of balance that we need to think about?
Thank you so much, everyone. I think we're at the end now. And I don't think we have any time for questions, but there's an option on the app to submit them, and we can see if we can just respond to you later on. Like, I could do that, not you guys. I won't put that work on you. So thank you so much for listening, and we hope that this was an informative session for you on Indigenous perspectives. Thank you. Thank you to our panelists. We're often left out of these conversations and lumped into categories without an understanding of our unique needs and perspectives and relationships. So if there's anything that we can leave you with, it's that Indigenous people should always be centered in conversations that relate to our economic relationships.